All right, so we have made it well through the aquatic biomes, and aquatic means what, class? Having to do with water. And so our big one was the marine biome. Obviously, that's the biggest of all the biomes, had the most biodiversity. We learned about the fact that that has salt water, and then we kind of moved inland a little bit, not all the way, not too far, because it was right where rivers and oceans meet with that brackish water called a what, class? Estuary. And we learned a lot of different facts about the estuaries, and I sure hope that we are finished with our estuaries Google Doc, because if you are not, you are behind, and you should probably try to catch up on some of that at home and stop wasting so much time during rhyme and morning work when you just sit there and do nothing, right? Because some of us aren't using our time efficiently. And after we moved from there, we moved inland all the way, and we started talking about fresh water, which is water with no salt, lakes, rivers, streams, and ponds. And then we moved, now that we had got done with all of the aquatic biomes, we moved into the terrestrial biomes. And terrestrial means what? Hands up. Terrestrial means what, Maddox? Having to do with land. So all of our land biomes. And we started with the grasslands. And we learned there's two different types of grasslands. We have the savanna, which is what you see in Africa. We have the prairies, which is what you see in America. And both of those, the main plant life was grass. Now, there's a big difference in the savannas and the prairies. The prairies, as you can see, are going to have very different animals, bison and buffalo, things of that nature. You're going to see those prairie dogs, which obviously kind of makes sense. You'd see a prairie dog in a prairie, right? I don't think you'd see a prairie dog in the jungle. That doesn't make much sense. And we learned that because grass is the main life form, we had to learn some of the reasons why. Well, one of the reasons why is it doesn't rain enough in the grasslands to support a whole lot of trees. If you're going to be a tree in the grassland, you got to have an adaptation to put up with not a ton of rain. But obviously the soil there is very good. And so, Sadie, it got a little different once we got on land, because when we were in the oceans, we were the estuaries, the lakes, ponds, rivers, and streams. Every time we talked about abiotic factors like the sun, the climate, and the water, it kind of changed and varied a little bit, right? Especially the sun and the climate and the soil as well. But now that we're on land, it starts to get a little more narrowed down, which is what makes each biome unique. And so the grass here is growing in extremely fertile soil. And we took notes on the grassland and did a good job there. Super hot summers, pretty cold winters. Most of the snow in the prairies is how they get their water. We moved through that. And so we went on through here, and here's our prairie dogs. And I'm going to keep on moving. Oh my goodness gracious, how many of those are there attached? And there was our grassland anchor chart notes. Now, Veda, I don't think it's very hard, in my opinion, to take this and turn it into 2 paragraphs on the prairie. We've done that enough now that I think it's pretty easy to do. And then we moved into the savanna. And this is one that I think that a lot of us are most familiar with, because it looks like something we'd see in a Disney movie, right? Zebras, lions, elephants, giraffes. And we learned about some different interactions that happen there. This looks like, I might be wrong, it's either the top of the tree or a scavenger waiting on something to die. I can't tell which. Looks like a big bird, but I'm not too sure. Can you see it good on your screen? Because I can't see it great on mine. It does, but it also does look like it's on this tree too. Could be part of the tree. I don't know. It's either a scavenger or it's part of the tree. But we learned about that acacia tree too when we were talking about this. Again, they have 2 seasons. They have a dry month, and they have like basically their monsoon months. And when they say winter, quote unquote, it's 68 degrees is about as cold as it gets. That's not much of a winter, because it was colder this morning than it most of the time ever gets in the savanna. That's mainly because they're a little bit closer to the equator, and it stays a little warmer there. Now, obviously, if you're going to have rainy months and then super dry months, you have to adapt to that. If I'm a plant, I can't just move around and migrate when the water runs out. I have to adapt to the different rainy seasons and the dry seasons. But if I am an animal, I can migrate, hibernate, and do what I need to do to get through that. And we moved on through the savanna. We watched a very cool video on the acacia. And we talked about the animal life inside of a savanna. And then that moved us into the tundra. Now, we just started reaching on the tundra when we started talking last week. I know we took some notes about the tundra biome. It is the coldest of all the biomes. So again, Anna, I'm writing my sentences, right? I'm working on my Google Doc for the tundra. Number 1, the tundra is the coldest of all biomes. There's 1 sentence. The tundra is terrestrial, period. 2 sentences. Terrestrial means having to do with land. 3 sentences. Now I just got to talk about the sun, the soil, the temperature, and the water of the tundra. And I have finished my first paragraph, and then I'll talk about biotic factors and how they adapt. The soil in the tundra, terrible. Number 1, it's super rocky. So even if it wasn't freezing cold most of the time there, you would have a tough time growing anything because of all the rocks in the soil. But number two, there's this certain thing where the ground is kind of frozen all the time. And what was that word that they use? It's going to show up on tests and quizzes, where the ground is permanently frozen after it's about 6 inches down. Brandon? Permafrost. So you can't be a tree and live there because your roots can't go deep enough into the ground to support you, number one, which is the big thing. And number two, to get any of the nutrients and water out of the ground, because you can't get water if it's frozen, and kind of hard to get nutrients if the ground is frozen as well. So again, tundra is a Finnish word meaning treeless plain. And well, one of the reasons why is because of the permafrost. So we know the soil is terrible. The sunlight is not very intense. We all passed around the little globe in class, and we kind of saw how the sun, at least the sun beams, glance off the top of the earth. And that's important to understand. So your sun is really not that intense. Your soil is pretty terrible. Water. I know there's a lot of snow there, but this is the second driest biome, which shocked, I think, a lot of us in here, right? That was like when I told you that bones make red blood cells. It was like, whoa, wait a minute, what? Can you repeat that? That's right. This is the second driest biome right behind the desert because it doesn't get a lot of rain. And what does fall falls in the form of snow in the wintertime. Extremely cold temperatures. So we've got the sun, the soil, the temperature, and the water. We've kind of covered all of the abiotic factors. You can put those in your notes, and then you can write your paragraph about that. Again, when we talked about the ocean, one of the sentences I saw some of us put in there was the ocean has the highest amount of diversity of organisms. This is one of the lowest. And there's a lot of reasons why, right? To live there, you got to be able to survive freezing cold temperatures, very little water, not a whole lot of sunlight. That pretty much throws out just about all plants, right? They need water, they need sunlight, and they need it to be somewhat warm because the plants we put in the freezer still haven't grown, by the way, because the ground is permafrost. It's permanently frozen. It's not going to unfreeze in the freezer if it stays cold all the time. Although when it does unfreeze in the quote-unquote summer, you'll see that it's super squishy like a sponge, but it's just not great and conducive to a bunch of plants growing when it's super cold most of the time, and then a very, very short, like maybe 2 months of the growing season. So if you're a plant, got 2 months to live, then it's time to die and go back into hibernation again, which is not a lot of fun. If you're an animal living here, you got to adapt to the same things, right? Super cold, lots of snow. The earth is kind of brownish in the quote-unquote summer, and then super white in the winter because of all the snow, so you have to have your coat change color, kind of like the Arctic hare does. That way the other animals don't see you, because if you're white running around on brown earth, they're going to see you and catch you pretty quickly, and vice versa. If you didn't change your coat color in the wintertime and you were a brown rabbit running around the white snow, pretty obviously who you are and where you are, right? Wouldn't take a lot of time to find you and get rid of you. We talked about migration as well. Some of the birds there migrate. When it gets too cold and it's just too miserable, they fly south, which is what a lot of birds do depending on where they live. Some things like hibernate, and they sleep through the toughest parts of the winter, which would be what I would want to do. And that brings us today to the Arctic bumblebee. Now, when we did the savanna, there was this really unique thing in there called the acacia tree and its relationship with the giraffe, right? Which made my second sentence about biotic factors even easier to write. When we were talking about the swamps, we could talk about the different types of trees that were there. We talked about the estuaries. We talked about mangrove trees. So if you're talking about probably one of the coolest animals we'll talk about in a while, the Arctic bumblebee. Now here's the crazy thing. Bumblebees are cold-blooded animals. Who knows what that means? Who knows what it means to be cold-blooded? Dawson. Sometimes you need sunlight to survive. That is correct. Akat. They have a hard time making their own body heat, and they pretty much take on the temperature of their surroundings, right? So like if you have a pet lizard, you have to have a heat lamp so that the lizard can keep a certain temperature and stay alive. Now, would living in the Arctic sound like a smart move for a cold-blooded animal? No. However, this one has a special Adaptation, there's that word again, that allows it to overcome the cool temperatures. Again, we watch a lot of this in the video, but on sunny days, you see the Arctic bumblebee and queen workers, they'll lay in the sun, soaking up the sun, which is probably what I would do if it was super cold outside. They also take advantage of how those cupped flowers kind of reflect sunlight and the heat inside of it to keep themselves a little warm. They also have a way to make their body kind of generate and shake the way we shiver when we're cold. They have a very similar mechanism. They can kind of shiver, and it helps bring up their body heat as well. So again, here it is. Bumblebees can shiver their large muscles to generate enough heat to bring their body temperature up to the minimum flight temperature, which is really kind of crazy to think about, especially when it's like super cold. Now, obviously, I don't think that they're like flying around when it's like -50, right? That doesn't make sense because, number one, what are they going to eat? There's no flowers growing in -50 degrees. They probably spend a majority of their time out and about in those 2 months of the growing season, which we will see in the video that hopefully the people that are watching this will watch at home. So before I dive into the video, I want to make sure everybody has their notes on the Arctic, not the Arctic, on the Arctic in general. I'm going to move this up here, stretch it out. Whoops. There we go. Make sure you have at least this in your notes. Obviously, there's a whole lot more stuff that I've said, Amanda, but I'm really kind of like taking all the stuff that I said and writing it in as short of a form as possible. Coldest of all the biomes. The sun's not intense due to the tilt of the earth. The soil is terrible, rocky, and permafrost. The temperature is the coldest of all the biomes. Long winters, short summers, quote-unquote summers, when it's 50 degrees is the high. Water, it's the second driest biome just behind the desert because most precipitation is snow and ice. And we talked about biotic factors, polar bears, lemmings, caribou, seals, moss, and lichen. And they have all adapted. The moss and lichen have adapted to that little water and very low light. They have very short, shallow roots. They don't need to be dug deep into the ground like a tree. The animals adapt too. They hibernate or migrate. Camouflage is important. Just abbreviate that as camo. And thick fur coats help with the cold. Very, very short, focused notes there. So again, we're going to kind of wait, in class at least, and watch the Arctic bumblebee documentary. We're going to get all the notes in for the people that happen to be at home. So we've moved from the tundra to something called the taiga. So we went from the tundra to the taiga. Now, you got to think about it like this, Shayla. We're going from the top of the earth, and we're just kind of like, pretend like we can kind of walk all the way down to like the equator. We're not walking real far from the tundra before we start to see trees. Now, once I start seeing trees, I say to myself, I must not be in the tundra anymore because the tundra doesn't have many trees, right? And if you look in here, like, it's not like there's just 1 or 2 trees. That's a bunch of trees, right? You would say to yourself, holy cow, it's still freezing cold. There's a lot of snow, and we still have these like short, wet summers here, but there's trees everywhere. I must be somewhere different, and that place that you are is called the taiga. The taiga is also called the coniferous. You might see boreal, but coniferous forest. Now, we've had that coniferous word in morning work before. Who remembers what that word means? Nobody. All right. Well, let's... When we are talking about the coniferous forest, the boreal forest, the taiga, we're looking at mostly cone-bearing trees, very similar to the pine tree. It is the largest of the terrestrial biomes, which is pretty awesome. It's found all over the place. Long, cold winters, short, very mild, wet summers. Obviously, you get very, very cold winds coming down from the Arctic, which makes it very cold in the taiga. The day varies based on the seasons because of the tilt of the earth. There's that again. We'll get into the fires inside of a taiga later on and why those are important and how they are not quite as destructive as you might think they are. And looking at our time on here, I'm going to stop here.